here's everything you might have missed in the Falcon and Winter Soldier, Episode 1. Action, adventure, explosions, 100-year-old men, seafood. The Falcon and Bucky show's first episode had all of this and more. This globe-trotting Marvel series kicked off in a surprisingly somber fashion in spite of its explosive action sequences, setting the stage for a complex series that'll deal with issues like American exceptionalism, the burden of legacy, how the blip changed geopolitics, and so much more. And while there was nary a Mephisto in sight, there is still plenty to dig into in the Falcon and Bucky Show Episode 1, titled New World Order. As always, if you prefer to read all about it, Rosie Knight has you covered over on Nerdist.com. However, in order to do so, we do need to spoil the living daylights out of this episode, so if you haven't seen Episode 1 yet, make like this unsuspecting guard and find the nearest exit. Picking up approximately 6 months after the events of Avengers Endgame, the Falcon and the Winter Soldier begins on a relatively somber note. Much like WandaVision, grief, loss, and a sense of displacement loom large over this world where suddenly, out of nowhere, half the world's population disappeared for 5 long years. We hear echoes of the iconic Endgame exchange in which Steve Rogers gives Sam the shield, but Sam is still doubting himself. He doesn't feel like the shield belongs to him. He isn't quite ready to accept the responsibility of becoming the next Captain America because he doesn't believe that he's worth it, and so he packs it away. It's a theme that we'll revisit in this episode and this series time and time again. The show then drops us right back into the action with Sam Wilson working for the US Air Force on a high-stakes aerial recovery mission somewhere over Tunisia trying to rescue a target, Captain Vassant, from goons from a militia known as the LAF, which I'm going to assume stands for Lame-Ass Foes. The LAF are led by Batroc the Leaper, played by former MMA fighter George St. Pierre, clad in purple and orange a la his comic book counterpart. Now, we first saw this character back in Captain America the Winter Soldier, and considering his comic book connections to Baron Zemo and his 2 iconic groups, the Masters of Evil and the Thunderbolts, I've got a sinking feeling that we haven't seen the last of this wingsuit-wearing Master of Savate, his signature French form of kickboxing. Over the course of Sam's mid-air mission, we do see the return of Redwing, his trusty drone, who in the comics is an actual Falcon named Redwing, which is something I will never, ever, ever forgive Kevin Feige for not including. Kevin, if you're watching, and I know you are, give us the bird. Not like that. During the pre-mission briefing on the computer screen, we see several numbers, which means, you guessed it, comic book references. The number 325 could reference Captain America 325, a genuinely bonkers issue about a drug dealer named the Slug and Cap's former sidekick Jack Monroe as Nomad. Now, Nomad was also the identity that Steve Rogers assumed when he gave up these Stars and Stripes for a period of time, which is a moniker we could see referenced later in this series in some capacity, given how it's going to deal with Cap's legacy. C-130 is almost definitely Captain America 130, in which they fight against Batroc the Leaper, including a new version of Batroc's Brigade, a group of mercenaries organized by that bouncing baddie. Now, another fun fact, in this issue, Batroc is hired by someone named The Hood, who turns out to be Baron von Strucker, that Hydra dingus who in the MCU is responsible for experimenting on Wanda and Pietro Maximoff. Lastly, we see 605, which could refer to Captain America 605, part of the Two Americas storyline, in which Bucky is the current Captain America and alongside Falcon fights a warped version of Steve Rogers that's actually another guy named William Burnside who launches a failed coup against the government. So, pretty apropos for this moment in history and this series. During this mission, we also meet Lieutenant Joaquin Torres, who comic fans should immediately recognize as the second person to become the Falcon. Created by Nick Spencer and Daniel Acuna, he first appeared in Captain America Sam Wilson number 3. Joaquin gains powers after a deranged scientist, Dr. Karamallis, performed experiments on him to turn him into this weird human-falcon hybrid using Sam Wilson's actual pet/partner Redwing, which is pretty dark. Hopefully we won't see that particular origin play out in this series, but Joaquin does seem to be stepping into the role of Sam's sidekick. One of the nicest moments in this episode, though, is when a man recognizes Sam at a Tunisian cafe and thanks him for bringing his wife back to him when they defeated Thanos. While the world is still healing from the deep collective trauma of Infinity War, it's nice to see a ray of hope for a change. Unfortunately, that hope is short-lived because Joaquin then shows Sam an augmented reality symbol of the Flag Smashers, an anti-nationalist group that think the world was actually better during the blip. They want a world without borders. And as we've discussed previously, the Flag Smashers are an amalgam of a couple things from the comics, namely the villain Flag Smasher and his anti-nationalist group Ultimatum, or the underground, liberated, totally integrated mobile army to unite mankind. Just flows off the tongue. We know they seemingly have superpowers, but more on that in just a little bit. First, Joaquin's also kind of an Avengers fanboy. He asks about a conspiracy theory that Steve Rogers is actually on the moon. Now, this might actually be a super deep cut reference to the Pulse House of M special, an alternate reality newspaper featuring a story about Captain America walking on the moon. It could also reference the Lighthouse, the moon base used by the Secret Avengers, the group formed when Steve took charge of S.H.I.E.L.D. in the comics. Next up, in Washington, Sam gives a moving speech at the dedication ceremony for a Captain America exhibit at the Smithsonian, and for a second, he really makes you think he's going to accept the mantle of Captain America, just for a moment, when he's talking about needing new heroes suited for the times we're in. Now, quick side note, with the way that Sam is talking about legacy and the farewell Steve banners in the background, we can't help but wonder if Steve Rogers actually finally shuffled off this mortal coil, or if he's just retired. A military official then tells Sam that coming forward with the S.H.I.E.L.D. was the right decision, which just feels all types of gross, like they don't have faith in Steve Rogers' chosen successor. Thankfully, though, a familiar face is there to try and gas Sam up, Don Cheadle as James Rhodes, aka War Machine. He asks Sam point blank why he didn't take up the mantle, but Sam doesn't seem to believe that he deserves to be Captain America. He's still having a hard time separating the S.H.I.E.L.D. from the Steve of it all. The world may be different, but Sam, quite literally in this exhibit, is stuck in the past. Inside the exhibit, there are Easter eggs and references galore. The background is a pastiche of iconic moments from Steve Rogers' past, both in the comics and the MCU. We see Cap's old First Avenger uniform, the classic soldier uniform that Steve wore when he enlisted in the army, and references to Bucky's time as the Winter Soldier, Hydra's Nazi roots, and the Sokovia Accords from Civil War as well. There's a list of the Fallen, who are basically all people that work at Marvel Studios and on Falcon and the Winter Soldier, but my favorite though is probably still the Jack Kirby and Joe Simon cover for Captain America #1, which features Captain America punching Hitler in his stupid Nazi face. Other details include a shout out to the Howling Commandos, Nick Fury's traditional comic book compatriots who fought alongside Cap in the first Avenger and also appeared during Agent Carter. Now, part of the exhibit also refers to Steve as the Captain, which could be a subtle nod to the 1980s storyline, where Steve Rogers renounced the Captain America title and simply went by the Captain for a time. Now, fun fact, the suit worn by Steve during that period would later be worn by John Walker when he becomes US Agent, but more on that and him when we meet him later this episode. Next, we get a dream sequence, one of Bucky's recurring nightmares about his time as the Winter Soldier murdering people for Hydra on all manner of missions. After bursting through the wall like a cyborg Kool-Aid man, Bucky takes out his target and then sets his sights on an unfortunate innocent man who could not get into his hotel room in time, and for the full ramifications of that moment, we'll get to that in just a little bit, but suffice it to say, Bucky's ledger is blood red, and these nightmares are a frequent occurrence. Bucky's going to government-mandated therapy. This is a condition of his pardon by the government for all the aforementioned murdering he did on Hydra's behalf as the Winter Soldier. To help process his deep-seated trauma, Bucky has a list of people to whom he's trying to make amends. Of course, Bucky's method of making amends involves significantly more espionage, hacking, and bringing scumbags to justice by whatever means necessary than the rules of his making amends allows for, but everybody heals differently. Now, there are some awfully interesting and significant names on Bucky's list. H. Zemo immediately stands out, most likely Helmut Zemo, Daniel Bruhl's purple mask-wearing villain that we first met in Captain America Civil War, and he will be back this season to play a major villainous role. It could also be Heinrich Zemo, Helmut's father, who in the comics is also a purple mask-wearing ne'er-do-well. There's also L. Kaminsky, a reference to Len Kaminsky, the Marvel writer and editor that co-created War Machine, and he also wrote a story in the 1991 Marvel Holiday Special Anthology called Precious Gifts, in which Steve Rogers meets a woman named Rebecca, who turns out to be Bucky's sister. Later in the episode, on his date, Bucky does mention his sister, which has us wondering if we could see another version of Rebecca, namely Ricky Barnes' alternate reality granddaughter at some point in this series. Not like an actual multiversal version, maybe like, I don't know, a version of her, maybe his grandniece, who knows? Another name on this list, A. Rostov, is Andrei Rostov, the Marvel villain known as the Red Barbarian, who's battled Bucky in the past. Another deep cut is C. Kuznetsov, likely referencing Dr. Kuznetsov, creator of the Soviet robot Udarnik, although I don't really know what beef Bucky would have with him in particular, but I'm sure we'll find out. And while there are Nazi characters named Hauser in the comics, and Harry Hauser, a skeezy talk show host that has it in for Sam Wilson when he's Captain America in the comics, the only P.W. Hauser I can think of is Richard Jewell and Cobra Kai actor Paul Walter Hauser. So maybe Bucky didn't care for how he treated the students of Miyagi-Do or something like that, I don't know. As for the other names on that list, your guess is as good as ours, but if you do crack the code, let us know in the comments below. Now, Easter eggs aside, Bucky is struggling. Apart from his time as the White Wolf in Wakanda, he's been in constant wars and battles for 90 years straight. That would take a toll on anybody. Bucky doesn't know what to do with his newfound freedom. He spends most of his time with Yori Nakajima, an elderly man with whom he regularly eats lunch at the local sushi bar. And thankfully for Bucky, Yori is a smooth operator and gets him a date with the server Leah. So look out, Falcon, because Bucky already has a wingman. Next up, Falcon may not be ready to be Captain America, but he's already Uncle Sam. We see Sam's sister Sarah and his nephews working the Wilson family seafood business in New Orleans, which apparently has seen better days. The family boat is named for Sam and Sarah's comic book parents, Paul and Darlene, but as we can see from this, memories unfortunately don't pay the bills. As Sarah points out, while Sam was off fighting Dr. Space Cape, she was busy keeping the family business quite literally afloat. And unfortunately, just like at the Smithsonian, Sam is stuck in the past. He's trying to make up for lost time, but he still isn't coming to grips with the reality of the situation for those who remained. And while this is happening, Bucky has his long overdue date with Leah, but it becomes a tad overwhelming when she suddenly brings up Yori's dead son while they're playing Battleship. As it turns out, one of the reasons Bucky is hanging out with Yori so much is the immense guilt that he feels for killing Yori's son. That's right, Yori's son was the unfortunate hotel guest that got caught in the middle of the Winter Soldier's rampage. But Bucky still can't bring himself to tell Yori the truth, and thus cannot in good faith make amends to this man whom he wronged on such a deep level. While Sam and Sarah head to town to get a loan for their family business, Joaquin Torres scopes out a meetup of the Flag Smashers in Switzerland, which basically becomes this V for Vendetta style flash mob with masked people creating a distraction while the Flag Smashers rob a local bank. Here we get our first glimpse of just how freakishly strong the Flag Smashers actually are. One of their number kicks a guard like he's absolutely nothing and stomps Joaquin's face into the pavement. Back in New Orleans, Sam and Sarah encounter the unlikeliest of fanboys, the loan officer at the bank. And even though Sam is an Avenger, one of Earth's mightiest heroes, he and Sarah can't get a loan. Although the banker rather gauchely asks if Sam was on an allowance from Tony Stark, the reality is that despite saving the world, Sam isn't fabulously wealthy. Being an Avenger doesn't pay well. They depend on the goodwill of others. As people like director Kari Skogland and writer Malcolm Spellman told Nerdist in recent interviews, this series will address some harsh realities about the world, including issues of race. And what's happening to the Wilsons feels like a textbook example of redlining. It's a discriminatory practice in which things like loans and mortgages were systematically denied to black people and other people of color. Sam may have saved the world countless times, but here he's powerless in the face of decades of discriminatory policy. Embarrassed and feeling defeated, Sarah calls Sam out for basically doing exactly what Bucky's doing, trying to make amends to make himself feel better. She reminds him that he doesn't get to swoop in like this conquering hero. Sam wasn't around when it mattered, and some wounds take a long time to heal. It's more of this push and pull between keeping the past in perfect stasis under the auspices of preserving a legacy versus charting a brand new course for oneself. After that, Sam FaceTimes with Joaquin, who sends a hilarious "help, I just got beat up" selfie, and there's a fascinating moment where they're commenting on just how superhumanly strong the Flag Smashers are. Joaquin says, "You don't think he's a..." But Sam cuts him off. So what was Joaquin about to say? Well, as much as I want to say mutant and see your exasperated reactions, the answer is probably just like enhanced individual or whatever nomenclature they love to use in the MCU. The moment that was cut short by a WHIH news report, the MCU's leading news network that you may recall from WandaVision and Iron Man 2. It's a government press conference where they basically repurpose Sam's entire touching speech about Steve Rogers and his legacy, saying they need someone to inspire them again. In a shocking betrayal of Sam, they reveal the US government has gone ahead and made their own version of Captain America, John Walker. He's the single doofiest looking dude ever to grace the Marvel Cinematic Universe, complete with Steve Rogers' iconic shield. And while he looks like Casey Neistat in cosplay, this is actually Kurt Russell's son, Wyatt Russell. That means we're just one Goldie Hawn away from making them a full-on MCU family. For those who don't know, John Walker was first introduced in 1986 as Captain America 323 as the villainous super patriot. He embodied all the parts of nationalism and jingoism that Steve Rogers did not. He's brash, violent, unforgiving. Before taking on the code name of US Agent and joining the West Coast Avengers, Walker actually did become Captain America for a period of time, appearing as a more violent, hard-edged version of the Avenger that people knew and loved. He crossed lines that Steve Rogers would never, and became this more Rambo-esque version of the Star-Spangled Avenger. And considering that much like in WandaVision, John Byrne is among those thanked in the end credits, it might be worth revisiting some of the US Agent's exploits in the pages of West Coast Avengers if you're looking for some weekend reading. Regardless, Sam has an awful lot to grapple with moving forward, because not only does he not believe that he's worthy of being Steve's chosen successor, but the US government pulled a fast one on him, unraveling the complicated legacy of Captain America and what it means to step into the shoes of an icon. Those are going to be major issues to untangle as this season unfolds. Although there are no mid-credits or post-credit scenes, there are plenty of clues to be gleaned from the credits. We see text being slowly redacted and covered with various names. There are teases of a shadowy group pulling off a massive weapons heist, references to the text of the Sokovia Accords from Civil War, excerpts from legal documents about US extradition treaties and refugees, a note about forces from Madripoor, a major location in this series committing human rights violations, and reports of a masked man plunging downtown Prague into utter chaos. There's also repeated references to the assassination of Howard and Maria Stark by the Winter Soldier so he could gain access to the super soldier serum that we first learned about in Captain America Civil War. This took place on Long Island, New York on December 16th, 1991. We also see Bucky's Winter Soldier code words on the wall to really hammer home how this series will explore his past as well. Most fascinating, though, is the connective tissue between the memo to General Thunderbolt Ross about the redacted Enhanced Humans Act and a frame featuring small blue vials of liquid that looked like the super soldier serum that gave Steve Rogers his powers back in the day. In this shot, we see the cryptic note Power Broker watching. In the comics, Power Broker are the ones to give John Walker his super strength so that he can become Super Patriot, their corporate goon. This seems to imply that in this show, Power Broker are going to be the ones supplying the US government with the materials they need to make their own enhanced humans that they can control. In the lower left corner as well, we see black and white people standing side by side, and this, coupled with another shot of what appears to be some sort of research case file, features Carl Lumbly as Isaiah Bradley. This means we are almost definitely going to be exploring the events of the Truth Red, White, and Black miniseries. In the comics, Isaiah Bradley was one of 300 African-American soldiers in the United States Army that were experimented on to create super soldiers in a horrifying parallel of the real-life Tuskegee experiments. Known as the Black Captain America, Isaiah's story is one of the many ways in which this show will explore the complicated legacy of Captain America, his shield, and what it means to be a superhuman. Clearly, someone's been out there trying to make new super soldiers, but they've also been trying to do that for a very, very long time. Marvel could also use this to eventually introduce Elijah Bradley, Isaiah's grandson, the superhero known as Patriot that goes on to become a member of the Young Avengers, a group that is heavily rumored to be coming to the Marvel Cinematic Universe in a future phase. And there you have it, folks. That is everything we spotted in the Falcon and Bucky Show, Episode 1. It's an auspicious start to this series, leaving us with plenty of questions that we hope will be answered next week. And according to our interview with writer Malcolm Spellman, you won't want to miss that episode.
I cannot wait for you. If you're a real Marvel fan, you're going to get a glimmer in Episode 2. You're going to be like, oh, they going here with it.
In the meantime, though, you can watch Hector Navarro's fantastic interviews with Malcolm Spellman and director Kari Skoglund on our channels. And with that said, folks, tell us, what did you think of this series premiere? Did you spot anything that we missed? Let us know in the comments below, and for the latest and greatest in the world of pop culture, stay tuned to Nerdist.com.